Hey everybody, how's it going? Taylor Campbell here. I'm back with another video for you guys at the beginning of what I'm going to go ahead and just call Season 2 of Comic Crash. And today I wanted to introduce to you guys a brand new show. We've had the comic reviews happen, and to add along to that, I thought I'd add the show called Timelines. The premise of this show, I'm going to pick a concept or a franchise, take all of the available media about it, and try to come up with an all-inclusive timeline to explain the entire continuity of it. It sounds complicated, but I think you'll get the picture after we work with today's subject. Today's subject, incidentally, is one of the biggest, most all-encompassing timelines as it is. It's a movie franchise. It's been going on for well over 10 years. And of course, I'm talking about Superman the movie starring Christopher Reeve. Now, you might be saying, how is that complicated? Those movies are numbered, right? You have Superman 1, 2, 3, and 4, and anything numbered cannot possibly be complicated. Yeah. Anyway, this timeline actually gets very complicated, and there's a lot of movies that are actually a big part of it. So, let's head over to the whiteboard and let's draw this out. Ladies and gentlemen, the whiteboard. Now, we're talking specifically about a movie franchise right now, so we should start with the movies and where they all fit in. First thing we know that happens for sure is Superman the movie. This was the first movie in the franchise. It was probably Christopher Reeve's best performance. A lot of people would say this is the only indisputably good Superman movie there is. Last time I go for the cheat markers. In this movie, we see a lot of different things happen that can help out the timeline. But first we need to assign a year to this. The movie was released in 1978, but if we try using numbers, this thing is going to get way too complicated, way too fast. So we're going to say the movie happens in year X. Year X. Next thing we know, next point of data that we know. Superman was in the Fortress of Solitude learning about the human condition for about 5 years. So we can say that X minus 5 is his graduation date. We know that he came to Krypton when he was 4, so that's X minus 19. That was backwards. I hope you guys can appreciate how difficult this is. Superman arrived to Earth when he was biologically 4, but then some of the other movies, Jor-El mentions that it's been thousands of Earth years since Krypton blew up. So that's going to be a dashed line. We'll put this as X minus Z. X minus Z is when Krypton blows up. Krypton blows up. Now, Superman the movie, you guys have probably seen this. This is a big deal. Superman fights Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor has this plan to create an earthquake in California that will blow up half of California and give Lex Luthor a ton of beachside real estate. Superman is able to stop the missiles, however, he isn't able to save Lois Lane. And then he goes back in time to reverse everything that happened so that he can save Lois Lane. But then Jimmy remember Superman saving him specifically, which wouldn't have happened if he reversed time. And the only explanation I have for this is that the timeline branches here. We have the timeline where Superman saved the day by being Superman, and then we have another timeline where Superman saved the day by reversing time and overall being more Doctor Who than Superman. So let's talk about the Doctor Who timeline. Here we have Superman 2. Of course, General Zod is released from the Phantom Zone, and he just generally goes on to terrorize people. Superman decides to give up his powers so that he can be with Lois Lane, but then he gets his powers back and he vows never to leave Earth unprotected. That's important. You're going to have to remember that. Now, Superman 2, on this timeline, General Zod was released when Superman threw this H-bomb that these terrorists had into space, and it just so happened to blow up the Phantom Zone prison. So I'm going to say that this happens X plus 1. It happens the next year. There you go. X plus 1. Superman 2. Later on we've got Superman 3. It's kind of hard to imagine how weird Superman 3 actually was until you put the casting into modern ideas. So imagine you were going to go see Man of Steel, the sequel to Man of Steel, so Man of Steel 2. Imagine you were going to go see that, and you were excited to see Henry Cavill beat back the bad guy, and the majority of the movie starred Kevin Hart. That's what Superman 3 was. So yeah, Superman 4 it's weird, it's inconsequential right now, but now it was released 9 years after Superman 1, so I'm going to just go ahead and say this is X plus 9. And so that's the Doctor Who timeline. Now let's hop into the Superman timeline. Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut. Now, the Richard Donner cut is completely different from Superman 2, the regular. For those of you who don't know, Superman 2 was originally directed by the same guy who directed Superman 1. However, Warner Brothers and other producers and whatever else, they fired Richard Donner and then hired Richard Lester to go ahead and make the remaining movies. Richard Donner already had like 98% of Superman 2 finished, but then Richard Lester went in and almost refilmed the entire thing, did major script rewrites. However, right before Superman Returns was released, Warner Brothers found all of the archive footage and they put it together and made Superman 2 the Richard Donner cut. It is a completely different movie, and I'd recommend you see it because I actually really like the Richard Donner cut better than Superman 2. A couple of differences to note. In Richard Lester's version, Superman promised to never leave the Earth unprotected. He made no such promise in the Richard Donner cut. And the Richard Donner cut doesn't end with Superman giving Lois Lane a mind-erasing kiss. It ends with him reversing time. Again. Which makes my life hard because the last time this split off into 2 timelines. And it does the same thing here. So, what are these 2 branching timelines from the Richard Donner cut? Well, one of them is where Superman reverses time and nobody remembers anything and the events were fully erased. This can go back down to Richard Lester's Superman 3. It fits into the timeline still in that direction. However, there's the second timeline. The second timeline is where Superman has full time traveling immunity and his events with certain people, they carry on. Certain people being Lois Lane, certain events being their honeymoon getaway in the Fortress of Solitude. Now, in this timeline, we get a movie that is always confusing when people talk about it. It's like, what is this movie? Where does it come in? It comes in here, Superman Returns. However, we need to make sure we know where everything fits. In the Richard Donner cut, General Zod was released because Superman threw one of Lex Luthor's missiles into the sky, and this happens much earlier than it does in the Doctor Who timeline, making the Richard Donner cut happen maybe even just a few months later. So we'll go ahead and put X plus 0.3. And of course, Superman Returns is easy. They tell us it's been 5 years since Superman showed up. He has a kid in that one. We know the kid was a direct result of this. So this must have happened, best case scenario, X plus 6. There we go. So that's the movies. Time to talk about the spin-offs. We've got one spin-off movie in particular that is important to mention, and that is Supergirl. Supergirl was a movie that was released shortly after Superman 3 was released, and it starred the same actor who played Jimmy Olsen as Jimmy Olsen. It also was supposed to have Christopher Reeve show up, although he was busy at the time. I don't know what he was doing. Supergirl takes place between 3 and 4. There's another spin-off movie called Steel, but I'll get back to that. Now, let's talk about the comics. I love comic books. This is Comic Crash. We're all about comic books. So, how do comic books fit in? Some of these movies have comic book tie-ins, being specifically 3 and then Superman 4. Now, these are important because they've shed a more serious light on these 2 movies. Superman 3 becomes a lot more serious, a lot less Kevin Hart, and then Superman 4 becomes a lot more serious and a lot less bad. Other comic books, Supergirl got a comic book tie-in. There's a comic book adaptation of Superman Returns, which tells the same story, doesn't really add anything to it. However, there is another comic book, which was the Returns prequel series, which discussed Lois Lane, Lex Luthor, and Martha Kent's lives during this 5-year gap, to just kind of explain things and close up any gaps that are happening here. This 5-year gap actually is very well documented as we go along. You're going to see this. Video games. There was a video game, sort of, for Superman 1, though it doesn't do anything. It's just like an Atari game. You just fly around. It doesn't mean anything, so I'm not going to go ahead and count it. Really, the only video game here that counts is the video game tie-in to Superman Returns. I mean, it was released in 2006. Everyone had to have a video game tie-in. Now, what does Superman Returns video game do? Well, it adds in a couple of things. It tells us that Superman was fighting Mongol. He was fighting Mongol, which was why it took him so long to get back. We have a couple of other villains that branch off of here. Now, the weird stuff. It's time to talk about the weird stuff. And there is weird stuff. This is stuff that I'm saying people like to think that it's canon and it takes place on this timeline, but there's not a whole lot of evidence for it either. So let's go ahead and just talk about it. First thing, I promised we would talk about the movie Steel, so let's go ahead and do that. A lot of people say that Steel takes place in the Christopher Reeve timeline. However, it doesn't mention Superman very much. It mentions Batman more than it mentions Superman. And other than the character's name being Steel, it doesn't seem to be much of a connection. So, I mean, I don't think it takes place on this timeline. So I'm going to go ahead and put Steel down here. Not in the timeline. It is just off doing its own thing. It's not that good of a movie, but it was released, what, in 1997, I think? And it stars Shaquille O'Neal. So there's some novelty to this thing here. So Tim Burton, he made some Batman movies. In Batman and Robin, which sort of takes place in that Batman continuity, Batman mentions Superman by name. But knowing how the Tim Burton Batman movies are, they seem more similar, in my mind at least, to Lois and Clark, which was a TV series that ran in the 90s. So I'm going to say it's canon to that. So, in the question of, is Batman in canon with this, I'm going to say nah. Nah. Christian Bale! Christian Bale's Batman, however, is a different story. How can we say that this takes place there? Well, actually, when I was rewatching Superman Returns to research this timeline, I found something very interesting. They mentioned Gotham City by name specifically, and at the very beginning, Perry White asks for pictures about the Birthday Clown Massacre. Birthday Clown Massacre? I know a clown. Birthday Clown Massacre, I'm going to say that is the events of the Dark Knight. Dark Knight happens here. Batman Begins happens maybe a year afterwards, and then 8 years past that, we have The Dark Knight Rises. Dark Knight Rises can take place in this timeline if you put it in the Superman Returns timeline. Where is Superman during the events of The Dark Knight Rises? I don't know. Unfortunately, this timeline never got a sequel. And so that is the timeline of Superman the movie starring Christopher Reeves. Wait, no it's not. I forgot something. There was a book. This book was called Miracle Monday. It was about a holiday that Superman is tied to, but no one is really sure how. But a journalist from the future, so let's go dash, and this is future. We'll put it at X plus question mark because we don't know how far in the future. A journalist goes back in time to before the events of Superman 2, and accidentally becomes the villain of a book called Miracle Monday. So it's been kind of in question as to whether or not Miracle Monday is still in canon to this, because it was re-released outside of canon, but it was originally supposed to be a tie-in to Superman 1. So where I'm going to say that it takes place here, but it takes place in both timelines because the future was unaffected, and it was originally written to tie into Richard Donner's movies. So there you go. That is the timeline of Superman the movie. As you can see, it did get quite a bit more complicated than we thought it would. I want to know what you guys think. Did I miss something? What is your favorite movie here? Also, did you like Superman Returns? I mean, that one seems to be like one of the more divisive of the movies that we've mentioned. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Timelines. I guess this is the first episode of Timelines. If you have anything more you would like to see, go ahead and put it in the comments down below. And as always, until next time, thank you for joining me. Have a great day. And remember to always be your best self.